welcome to the Cochrane Show. My name is John Cochrane. This is my dad, Scott Cochrane. He's in Canada. I'm in Australia. We have a question that we're going to talk about today, and that question, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, so make sure you put your thoughts down. Can you be in the GOAT conversation if you've never won a championship? So GOAT meaning greatest of all time across all sports, whether it's individual or team sports. Can you be in the conversation?
Right. And John, there are some people out there who they say, of course you can. Yeah, you don't have to win a championship. And there's others who would say, what? No championship? You cannot even be in the conversation. And so there's two schools of thought out there. Be interested to see where this one goes.
And to, I think, look at it at a macro level, you'd look at the ring culture that has been developed in our leagues. But
Sure.
Dad, where do you lay on this question?
Well, you always accuse me of sort of waffling and not being clear. I think you can absolutely be in the GOAT conversation without a championship.
Explain,
How about you?
Because, well, in my in my humble opinion, I'd say there's no way that you can be in the conversation. Like that defeats the name of GOAT. If you haven't been at the pinnacle, you can't be the GOAT. It just doesn't make sense. You can be a great player. You can be an exceptional player. You can even be a Hall of Fame player. But you can't be even in the conversation of the greatest of all time.
But if that's the case, and here's the example that those of us in this camp often use, look at NFL football. How do you explain a Dan Marino? Dan Marino holds more records than just about any other quarterback in football. Most completed passes in one season, most completed touchdowns in one season, most career passing completions, most career touchdowns. Like, this guy has nailed everything. I don't think you can just dismiss that and say, yeah, but he didn't win the Super Bowl.
Sure you can. He's great. He's exceptional. He's a Hall of Famer. But he didn't accomplish what you play the sport to accomplish for. Like, he didn't accomplish the end goal. How can you be a GOAT if you didn't reach your goal?
Well, again, to be clear, we're not saying, is Dan Marino the greatest of all time? I'm building the case that he can at least be and should be in the conversation. I don't think you can have a conversation about the greatest of all time if you don't include Dan Marino as far as NFL quarterbacks are concerned. No,
sure you can.
I disagree. I admit that winning a Super Bowl ring or multiple rings or championships, of course, that ups your status in that. But at the same time, there are a lot of athletes who have won multiple championships who were marginal players at best, right?
For sure.
That is not in and of itself the determining factor. It can help you in terms of the conversation for GOAT, but you can absolutely be considered. Otherwise, what do you do with Charles Barkley? What do you do with Karl Malone? Like, these were some of the greatest NBA players ever. They just didn't happen to win the NBA championship. You can't dismiss them. Guys who won, 11 NBA All-Stars, all NBA 6 times. They just didn't get an NBA championship. I don't think you punt them to the curb. You've got to at least say, okay, they're part of the conversation.
You can identify them for what they are, which is really good players for their era. But I can name 10 players better than Charles Barkley. He doesn't crack the top 10. And if you're not in the top 10 all time, you're not in the GOAT conversation. You're in I may be the top 50 of all time, but is that GOAT? Like, where is the boundaries of the conversation? Do you accept anybody that has had a above average career as a GOAT? Like, you brought up Dan Marino, another two players similar to him. Drew Brees, however, he's won, so he might have an edge. Phillip Rivers. And what these quarterbacks or these really good players have in common is they come up against people that are actually in the GOAT conversation, right? The reason why Charles Barkley isn't in the conversation is because he came up against Michael Jordan, who's actually in the conversation. The reason why Carmelo Anthony, who's a basketball player, isn't in the conversation is because he came up against LeBron James, who is in the GOAT conversation. Like, there are levels to greatness, and it's not taking away from their greatness. It's just saying you're not defined as one of the greatest of all time. You might be influential, but you're not GOAT.
I'd go along with your reasoning in an individual sport. A tennis player who's never won Wimbledon is probably not in the conversation, no matter how good they were. A golfer who's never won a major championship on the PGA Tour is probably not in the conversation. But there are some players who the only reason they didn't win a championship is that even though they were one of the greatest players in the game, their team happened to suck. And I don't think that means that they can't be in the conversation. Look at Barry Sanders, one of the best running backs in NFL history. Only four NFL running backs have ever cracked the 15,000-yard career mark. Barry Sanders was one of them. And you're telling me that, yeah, but the Detroit Lions suck, therefore he can't be considered the greatest of all time. You can't hang how pathetic the Detroit Lions were during his era around his neck. The fact is, he was on a bad team, but he was one of the greatest players who ever played.
Unfortunately, in football, I would say that like a quarter, I don't think any other position except for quarterback can be considered the greatest of all time of the entire sport, right? You can't define football the same way you define basketball or even the way you define hockey. Like you're not gonna ever put a goalie as the greatest player of all time, but you'll have an own subcategory. But
All
you'll
right.
have a player as the greatest player of all time, right? In football, there's levels. There's the players that have the biggest impact on the team winning is always going to be the quarterback. You cannot
Sure.
win a Super Bowl without a good quarterback.
All right. But let's say the conversation was then not about the entire team or every position, but let's just say you wanted to have a conversation about who were the greatest running backs of all time. Okay. You would probably start with, well, let's look at the ones who have cracked the 15,000-yard mark in their career. There's only four. Are you telling me you cannot entertain Barry Sanders in that conversation because the Detroit Lions suck? Now you're not saying anything about Barry Sanders as a running back, whether or not he's the greatest running back of all time. You're simply saying, yeah, but the rest of the team suck. Therefore, he doesn't count.
Well, I think if I had a player, I don't know. I don't know if this player exists, but you got Barry Sanders with his stats, and then you compare an exact same player with the exact same stats. However, they won 3 Super Bowls. I'm probably taking the player that won the Super Bowls.
Now, did they win the Super Bowls or did their team accomplish that?
Well, I think to be great, you have to create greatness around you.
Yes, but okay, now we're going to camp on Barry Sanders for a minute. If you remember that era, he was like the one golden light that shone on a team that absolutely sucked. I mean, the Detroit Lions were absolutely pathetic, but no one could deny they had the best running back in the NFL. But when he's surrounded, it's not his job to recruit better draft choices, to make better trades, to build up the rest of the team. He did what he was called upon to do, which is to run the football, and he did it in his era better than anybody else. I don't know how you can say, but he doesn't count, at least for consideration as a GOAT.
I think, okay, you can consider a running back. You can consider an offensive lineman. You can consider a defensive end. You can consider a linebacker. You can consider all of these positional players as in the GOAT conversation for their individual positions. But in terms of football as a whole, the sport as a whole, I would find it very difficult to say a center is the greatest of all time NFL player.
No, but I think you could potentially say at his position.
Yeah, but that's not the conversation we were having today. It wasn't around positional greatness. It's around sport dominance.
Well, when you talk about greatest of all time, it's certainly fair. You can have the conversation who is the greatest receiver of all time? That's a legitimate conversation. Who is the greatest running back of all the time? Who's the greatest kicker of all time? You can have those conversations. I think if you're talking about greatest in football, I would agree with your point. How do you compare a kicker with a linebacker? They're so totally different, right?
Mm-hmm. And how do you compare a linebacker with a quarterback? So let's talk about quarterbacks because they're the ones that are driving the bus of the team. Like you talked about and this is what Shaquille O'Neal talks about being the bus driver. There's a difference between winning a championship as a role player and winning a championship as the person driving the bus. You've got people that are role players that have won championships that will never be in the GOAT conversation because they're just not that. Their stats, their career achievements plus championships don't all add up. But the quarterbacks drive the bus. And you can't tell me that Dan Marino has had a bigger impact on the sport or have had more success than Tom Brady or than Joe Montana. It's just not true. Yeah, he's had some great passing seasons. So has Phillip Rivers. Never won a Super Bowl. Isn't even in the top 10 of great quarterbacks.
Well, if you're saying you can't compare Dan Marino with Tom Brady, you also can't compare Marino with Rivers. I mean, they're not
Why?
anywhere close.
Yes,
Marino was an elite level NFL quarterback. He was among the best of the best.
So was
He just
Phillip
didn't.
Rivers.
Not in the
Most years he had more touchdowns, completion percentage, and yards than Tom Brady.
But he didn't match Dan Marino. Dan Marino he still owns most of the NFL passing records in the league. And I just don't think you automatically say that because he didn't win a championship. I'm not saying he is the best. Hey, if I were to put all my cards on the table, I think that in this era, we're seeing 2 or 3 of the best quarterbacks of all time. But I think Dan Marino's accomplishments at least puts him in the conversation.
Okay. You've been talking about Dan Marino with his records as a basis of your argument, and I hate to do this live, or I hate to do this on a podcast, but all-time NFL passing leaders, let's go. Tom Brady, 89,214. Most passing touchdowns, career. Tom Brady, 649. Most completions, Tom Brady, 7,753. Best career completion percentage, currently it's Joe Burrow. Most passing yards in a single season, Peyton Manning. Most passing touchdowns in a single season, Peyton Manning. Dan Marino does not show up on one record in the NFL.
But he did. All right. Since you're going to look at your cheat sheet, let me tell you another one. Let's go over to hockey for a minute, okay? And we're going to talk about the great Colin Fraser. Colin Fraser won multiple Stanley Cups with the Chicago Blackhawks and the Los Angeles Kings. His lifetime career, he got 58 points and averaged 9.7 minutes a game. What about the legendary Jordan Nolan? Won multiple championships with the Kings, scored 24 career goals and 52 career points.
Were they driving the bus?
The point is that maybe we're even over elevating the fact that, well, these guys won championships, so they get to be in the conversation. What I'm saying, of course it matters, but let's not overstate it. Let's recognize that individual accomplishments, individual excellence, yes, it's enhanced if you win championships. And I'm not saying that these guys that I've talked about are necessarily the GOATs. I'm simply saying that you can be in the conversation.
So someone's going to have to comment to settle this, because it's just not true. It just cannot be. We do live in a society where I'll talk about my GOAT, and that's my GOAT, and that's your GOAT. No, there is the GOAT, and there might be 3 people in that conversation. It's like the superstar club. Not everybody is a superstar. You're a great player, not a superstar. That's an exclusive club. We can't just give everyone a medal. It doesn't work that way.
Well, I like your
point. And if you haven't been to the mountaintop and done what you set out to achieve, I don't care how many passing yards you have. I don't care how many goals you have. You need to pair those goals, those accolades, with being a winner. And if you haven't won the championship, you can't classify yourself as winning at the highest level.
Well, it seems as though you and I have reached an impasse. So maybe your point is a good one, John. Maybe we ought to turn this now over to the comments. Let's see where people land on this. Can you be in the conversation for greatest of all time if your team didn't win a championship?
Tell me what you mean by the conversation. I know you want to wrap this up, but I'm not prepared to wrap it up. Tell me, what do you mean by in the conversation? Yeah, we can talk about anything.
Can you be considered?
No.
Yes.
Like, I can bring up anybody. And sure, we're having a conversation about it. You're never going to win the argument.
I think we're too quick to dismiss a player like a Barry Sanders because his team sucked.
No.
Yes.
I hear what you're saying with positional superiority, but I do think there's a difference from talent and greatness. I think there's a difference from greatness and goatness. There's so many levels. And when we're talking about GOAT, you're talking about, can we define GOAT as Mount Rushmore?
Well, that's a relevant conversation. I don't know if we can get into all that right now. Let's not overcomplicate it. GOAT is someone who's considered, let's define it, by their sport or by their position as being the best at that position or the best at that sport.
Why are you dismissing a Mount Rushmore conversation around the sport? Like, Mount Rushmore, that's an exclusive club. You can only have 4. I don't know what else is a conversation. Oh, all yeah, right. The top 50. You get a GOAT and you get a GOAT. Bah. No.
People better understand that your impression you just did is supposed to be me, I take it.
Yeah.
No, okay, I'll go with the Mount Rushmore thing, and I'll come right back to what I said before. That does winning a championship matter? To some degree, of course it does. Of course it does. I would also summarize by saying that there are a lot of players who have won multiple championships who are not very good. Okay. So we can't overstate the importance of a championship. And
Of
at the
course
same
not.
time, there are some excellent, excellent players who deserve consideration in the GOAT, and they may not have won a championship because their team wasn't very good, but they continue to excel.
Okay, so Dad, can I just ask you really quick off the top of your head? NHL, who's your top 4 ever?
Oh,
And be honest with yourself here.
yeah, I think you're going to talk about Wayne Gretzky.
Okay.
Hockey, like football, I mean, what do you do with goaltenders and things like that? So, like there's Gretzky and then so many others. And Gretzky would support both of our arguments because Gretzky was the greatest of all time and he won championships. Okay?
How do you know he would support your argument?
Because he was just as dominant after he won his 4th cup as he was before. He continued to break scoring records and so on, even though his subsequent teams weren't quite as strong.
Yeah, but he had already won. And then for goalies, like you can bring in Waugh, right? I would say Waugh is unanimously the greatest goalie of all time.
I don't know unanimously, but he certainly is one of the greatest of all time.
Yeah. And has he won a Stanley Cup?
He did.
Okay. So you got Gretzky, Stanley Cup, Waugh. Let's
Well,
say
I think
Waugh.
you're building up a straw man argument here. I didn't say that it doesn't matter if you've won a championship. I think it does. I just think that there are other factors that can still have a person in consideration to be on the Mount Rushmore. They're going to have a harder time getting up there because the others probably did win championships. I just don't like the idea that fantastic, dominant athletes are eliminated from consideration because their team suck.
Well, we're going to have to wrap up this conversation because you can't be great if your team sucks. It just doesn't work. It's an oxymoron because greatness makes your situation great.
Let me wrap up my side with this, okay? Based on your definition in terms of hockey, if we were going to have a GOAT defenseman category, Ray Bourque would certainly be potentially on Mount Rushmore. He played for, I don't know, 13, 14, 15 seasons kind of thing. He almost redefined the position of defenseman. His last season, he had never won a Stanley Cup with Boston. He got traded to Colorado and they won a championship. If he had retired before that, he could have still been considered a GOAT. The fact is that in his last year, he went to a team that happened to win the championship. That win did not define his greatness.
No, but it might have put an exclamation mark on it.
Certainly, but it didn't. He wasn't a mediocre player for 14 years. And then on the last year, he was great. In fact, it was probably the decline of his career when he won the championship.
Yeah, he wasn't driving the bus again. So I don't know if he... Yeah, I think I just have a higher standard of what goatness is than maybe you do. I think your bar is being just a great player, but you gotta take the elevator to the penthouse suite. And
by the way,
the ticket is a championship.
I would love it, by the way, if we would have maybe a part 2 of this one day, because here's what I would also include. Not only everything we've talked about in terms of individual accomplishments and the idea of do they have to win a championship, I would also argue this. I don't think you can be in the conversation if, in addition to your championships and in addition to your personal accomplishments, if you were a jerk off the field or off the ice. I think character belongs in that conversation, and that might be one for another day.
Say that to Michael Jordan.
Well, I think that is...
Sorry, Mr. Michael, you're not a GOAT. You weren't a very nice man.
I would say that that's worth a conversation.
All right, we got to wrap it up here, but please comment what you think. You need to settle the score because we have come to a crossroads and we just don't see eye to eye.
We love each other, but we are clearly at an impasse here.
All right, well, thanks for tuning in to The Cochran Show. Subscribe to get more content like this, and we will see you next week.